We'll be in Psalm 13 this morning. Psalm 13, we're actually going to go through both 13 and 14. But we'll start with 13 and go through it, and then we'll move on to 14. So, Psalm 13, beginning in verse 1. This is to the chief musician, a psalm of David. It says, "How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord? Forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long shall mine enemy be exalted over me? Consider and hear me, O Lord my God. Lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest mine enemy say, I have prevailed against him, and those that trouble me rejoice when I am moved. But I have trusted in thy mercy. My heart shall rejoice in thy salvation. I will sing unto the Lord, because he hath dealt bountifully with me." So, this is a psalm during a time of desperation. And this would have been around the time that David was hiding in the cave of Adullam, hiding away from Saul as Saul was seeking to kill him. We can briefly look back at 1 Samuel chapter 26. 1 Samuel chapter 26 and verses 19 and 20. It says, "Now therefore I pray thee, let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If the Lord have stirred thee up against me, let him accept an offering. But if they be the children of men, cursed be they before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day from abiding in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, Go, serve other gods. Now therefore let not my blood fall to the earth before the face of the Lord. For the king of Israel is come out to seek a flea, as when one doth hunt a partridge in the mountains." And he made himself, and he compared himself as a flea being hunted by Saul. He was saying that it's not worth Saul's time, that he's not a threat to him, but yet he knows that Saul wants to kill him. He knows that he is in danger, and so he's trying to convince Saul otherwise. But we know what happens after this. We know that David eventually ends up going to work with the Philistines and kind of works as a mercenary for them for a while. He doesn't trust God enough to stay home. He gets nervous and he packs and he leaves Israel. So he doesn't trust Saul for good reason, but he does have a faith problem in that he's not trusting God. So he's in deep distress during this time when he's hiding out in these caves. And you see this distress come out. It says, "How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord? Forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me?" It's been so long for him that he thinks that it's just going to be this way forever, that he's not ever going to get any peace. Verse 3 says, "Consider and hear me, O Lord my God. Lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death." David has trouble sleeping at this time. He's got trouble where he's afraid that if he falls asleep, it says in verse 4, "Lest mine enemy say, I have prevailed against him, and those that trouble me rejoice when I am moved." He's worried that he's going to get taken out either in his sleep, so he's having trouble falling asleep, and he's worried also that he's going to exhaust himself to death because he's not able to sleep. He's wanting God to help him with that. So that's kind of where he's at in his headspace at this time. But back in verse 2, it says, "How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long shall mine enemy be exalted over me?" And his enemy at this time is the Lord's anointed, the king of Israel. And he doesn't believe that it's morally right. He doesn't believe it's spiritually right to attack his enemy. He knows that if his enemy comes after him and he's caught, then he's caught. It's done. It's over with. He doesn't feel that it's right to go after Saul himself. And he doesn't. He basically lets Saul do whatever he wants and just runs away from him. So he's just in a state of despair almost. But he says back in verse 1, "How long wilt thou hide thy face from me?" So David, as an individual, feels that he's being forsaken. Now, I don't believe that God forsakes individuals. Once we're saved, we have the blood of Christ applied to our lives. We're not going to be forsaken. We're His eternally. No one's going to pluck us out of His hand. However, we do see, and I've said again and again and again, David here is serving almost as a type, or not almost, but he is serving as a type of Israel, which is a nation. So you have an individual being painted as a picture of an entire nation. So not everything's going to be 100% congruent, because one thing is not exactly like the other, but it's very similar in many ways. The way David's life goes, and the way that the way God uses him, compared to the way God will use the nation of Israel in the future. In Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 16, and then we'll read verse 17. It says, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Behold, thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, and this people will rise up and go a-whoring after the gods of the strangers of the land, whither they go to be among them, and will forsake me, and break my covenant which I have made with them. Then my anger shall be kindled against them in that day, and I will forsake them, and I will hide my face from them, and they shall be devoured, and many evils and troubles shall befall them, so that they will say in that day, Are not these evils come upon us, because our God is not among us?" And so God here is just telling Moses straight away, Moses, they're not going to stay with me forever. They're going to break the covenant, and when they do, I'm going to turn around and not look at them. And I'm just going to let it happen. That's what he tells them. He says in verse 18, "And I will surely hide my face in that day for all the evils which they shall have wrought, in that they are turned unto other gods." So it's very clear that God does have a point where He is willing to forsake when that covenant's broken between Him and His chosen people, His chosen nation. David here feels as though he's being forsaken. I don't believe he actually is being forsaken. I believe he's being tested, and he's being used as a type here, as a picture. But I don't think that God has actually forsaken him at this time. Now, once he finally starts to get through that despair, he begins in verse 3 to start asking of the Lord. He starts out, "You're not paying attention to me, Lord, and are you just never going to listen to me ever?" And then he starts asking him things. He says, okay, here we go. He says, "Consider and hear me, O Lord my God, lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest mine enemies say, I have prevailed against him, and those that trouble me rejoice when I am moved." He says in verse 5, "But I have trusted in thy mercy, my heart shall rejoice in thy salvation. I will sing unto the Lord, because he hath dealt bountifully with me." And he has a turnaround. He starts out saying, "Lord, are you going to forget me forever?" And then he comes around and he says, "The Lord has dealt bountifully with me." He says, "And I will sing unto the Lord." And so, those are kind of a few stages that we as Christians and anybody, any saints at any time during any age have gone through. You get in this pity party state where you think, woe is me. Look at what's going on. This is just pitiful. Well, Lord, maybe you'll be able to help me. I'll talk to you about it. And then you get to the point where you realize, well, Lord, you've just been so good to me. Even in the midst of all this, you have just been so good to me that I can't contain it. And that's David kind of had in 6 verses. He had that real quick turnaround there as he was writing this down. But again, this is out of desperation. This is during a very difficult time for him. So it's understandable from the human perspective, exactly how that works out. And so what you see here is you see, his state of mind and the things that happened to him. And we're not going to go read the whole story in 1 Samuel. I kind of briefly went over it just very quickly, but in that short amount of time, he went from pain and worry to praise. And that's always the best direction to go to. It's always best to just go to praising God for what he's done for us. things will work out better that way. So that is Psalm 13. We'll move on into Psalm 14 now, and we'll start reading in verse 1. It says, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they have done abominable works, there is none that doeth good. The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. They are all gone aside, they are altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread, and call not upon the Lord? There were they in great fear, for God is in the generation of the righteous. Ye have shamed the counsel of the poor, because the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that the salvation of Israel were come out of Zion, when the Lord bringeth back the captivity of his people. Jacob shall rejoice, and Israel shall be glad." So, we see in verse 1, and this should be a familiar verse here, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." I think one thing that's interesting about this word fool is that word fool in the Hebrew is Nabal, which should be a very familiar word to anybody familiar with the life of David, as David's wife Abigail was once married to a man named Nabal who refused to work with David. He actually kind of wanted to oppose David after David granted all of this free protection for him. Now, David didn't have the right attitude in that situation. He basically had the attitude, well, we've done all this protection for Nabal, just being here is protection for him, and he's not even willing to make any kind of deal. He's not willing to provide us anything in return. Let's just go take him out. That's kind of the way that was going in David's head. Nabal's wife Abigail came and put an end to that. But what we see is, that man was a fool. He lived up to his name. Regardless of whether David was right or wrong in his response, Nabal was just being foolish. There was no way he was going to be able to stand up to David, and there was no way without David that he was going to be able to stand up to the Philistines. He was a fool. And so this is, a fool is somebody, they're mad, they're insane. They're not of sound mind. So it says, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." If you can truly, and I mean 100% truly as an individual, believe to your deepest depths that there is no God, you are insane. You do not have all your faculties about you. You do not have all your wits about you. You are insane. Any rational person, whether they believe in the God of the Bible or not is a different question. Any rational person knows there has to be something greater than this. This had to come from somewhere. It had to have some kind of beginning. I'm not going to go into all of the arguments or so-called proofs of the existence of God, but one of the basic arguments was formulated back 300 BC, around the time of Aristotle. And he didn't believe in the God of the Bible, but the basic understanding is that there is this thing called the unmoved mover, which I think that's the language that was picked up by Thomas Aquinas, who was a follower of Aristotle, 1700, 1800 years later, something like that. But the idea is that if you believe that everything has a cause, that everything is caused by something, and scientifically, we have the understanding of cause and effect in our world, and it really helps us to make a lot of decisions. It helps us understand physics. It helps us understand chemistry, all these things, because we have this very basic underlying idea of cause and effect. If you believe that this podium was built by somebody, well, you go back to them. Well, you go back to the materials they use. Where'd the materials come from? Well, okay, it came from a tree. Well, where'd the tree come from? It came from a seed. And you go back and you go back and you go back and you go back. And you just keep going back, seed tree, seed tree, seed tree, seed tree, all the way back. Until you reach a point where you get to, okay, where'd the planet come from? Where'd the stars come from? Where'd the galaxy come from? Where'd the universe come from? Eventually, it all had to come from somewhere. And I don't care what timeline you're on, if you're a so-called scientist that believes it's billions and billions of years old, or whether you believe it's 6,000 years old, give or take a couple years. It had a beginning. Period. End of story. It had a beginning. And if it had a beginning, that means something had to cause it. If it's not eternal in and of itself, if the universe is not eternal, it had a beginning. There had to be something before the universe. Now, that's where you get into the argument. Well, what was that? Was that also another caused cause, or was it an uncaused cause, an unmoved mover? As Christians, we would look at the Bible and we would just look to our basic understanding and we would say, well, that's God. God, the unmoved mover. That's basically, it's not a Christian argument, but essentially God is the unmoved mover. Whatever the unmoved mover is, that is God, definitionally. That is the eternal. Now we have an understanding, a limited understanding of what that unmoved mover is, what that eternal being is, looking at it from our framework with our scriptures, which we believe are correct and inerrant 100%. But the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. A fool would, you'd have to be mad, you'd have to be insane to deny the universe had a beginning. Unless you posited that the universe itself is God and the universe itself is eternal, in which case you're still agreeing in some way that there is a God. So, anybody with any sense in their head is going to get back to God somehow, some way. Even if they don't believe in the God of the Bible, they're going to get to something, some higher power. Only a fool would deny that. So it says they are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good. And that's a very, sad state of affairs. The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. They are all gone aside. They are altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Now, we as Christians, we have this habit of when we read something like this, we want to think, well, just look around at the world today. That's describing the world today. Yep, for sure. That's what's going on today. And maybe so in some ways, but that's not what this is talking about. Even though today the world seems to be going in this direction, and it is going in this direction, we aren't there yet. We aren't to this point yet. This is talking about something that has not yet happened. This is talking about the tribulation period. It says in verse 4, have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread and call not upon the Lord. Now, one thing that I started to study as I was going through this chapter was that phrase, who eat up my people as they eat bread. And we have studied before about the plight of the Jews in the tribulation period. We're not going to go through a full study of it this morning. That would maybe need to take up time for its own whole lesson if we wanted to do that as a topic at some time. But essentially, there is scripture to back up that it appears that ritualistic cannibalism may take place during the tribulation period. On the part of the Antichrist side, that they are actually going to engage in a form of ritualistic cannibalism. And we do know that they are going to behead Jews. We do know they're going to behead people that refuse to take the mark of the beast. There may be some scriptural evidence to suggest that that's not where they're going to stop. That's just the preparation side of things. In the same way that you take a chicken to the lopping block, that's kind of what they're doing. And I know that's a gruesome, grisly way of thinking about it, but that's going to be a gruesome, grisly time. So I won't go further into details because I can already feel my own stomach churning a little bit. So we'll stop that discussion there. But you can also think of that, who eat up my people as they eat bread, and call not upon the Lord. You can think of it as there's going to be the wealthy, and this is true, and I'm not about to start any kind of political rally right here, so we'll stop that in its tracks. But and I'm typically not even one to talk about things in this framework, but you do have an upper, really wealthy class. Now, I'm not one that thinks that the upper, wealthy, rich people, the super rich, that they're rich because they're stealing from the poor. I don't think that makes sense, because if they're stealing from the poor, that implies the poor had something to be stolen. You don't get rich from stealing from poor people. It doesn't work that way. Just as that's kind of a basic little logical conundrum there when people say, that the rich are getting richer because they're stealing from the poor. But there is a dynamic where there is that opposition, where to a certain extent the poor sometimes are taken advantage of by the rich. And not only by the rich, but by the government, who seems to prop up the rich and put down the poor. So again, not getting in any kind of political rally, because I think both parties take fault in all of the stupid laws that they make that kind of perpetuates this kind of thing. So this isn't a party thing. This is a problem with man governing thing, which you can't look at any government in history that was perfect other than God's government. So what you see, though, is this idea that the rich are taking advantage of the poor. Either they're not paying them what they're owed, or what they should be owed for their jobs, or they're extracting, or they're charging extremely high prices for things that shouldn't be, and the prices are just too high, and they're pricing too many people out of the market. And that might be groceries, it might be housing, it might be whatever. Housing is a big one. People can understand that one today, as expensive as materials are, as expensive to build anything, or as expensive as land is to buy anything, or as expensive as an already constructed home is to buy anything. There's a lot of people who just can't afford to even buy a what we would call a starter home because of things that have occurred. And so there's somebody taking advantage of the system there. And so you could maybe interpret that, who eat up my people as they eat bread, as the workers of iniquity, the ultra wealthy, as taking advantage of God's people. Assuming there's that God's people are not among the ultra wealthy, which there are rich Christians, there are poor Christians in the tribulation. That I don't think that's going to be the case. I don't think you're going to run into any rich saints in the tribulation, not materially rich anyway, because the only way you can be materially rich at that time is to not be a saint. You got to take the mark of the beast. You've got to sell your actual soul and your body and everything to the Antichrist, to Satan. And once you've done that, that's just as permanent of a transaction as salvation is. You do that and you have signed yourself away. So that's this idea that we're looking at, though. There's the physical, actual eating of people, and then there's also the figurative eating of people and their resources. In verse 5, there were they in great fear, for God is in the generation of the righteous. Ye have shamed the counsel of the poor, because the Lord is his refuge. And so we get now to this section where, God is going to take care of these that are being taken advantage of, that are being robbed, that are being eaten, that are being destroyed. God will protect them. God will take care of them. And if they suffer in this life, there's rewards in the next one. If they die in this life, then they'll be in the next one. But in verse 7, "Oh, that the salvation of Israel were come out of Zion, when the Lord bringeth back the captivity of his people. Jacob shall rejoice, and Israel shall be glad." Now that, to me, seems like an extremely plain, says what it means verse. There are people who deny that Israel, will, that the captivity will be returned. There are some people who say, well, Israel today is the fulfillment of the prophetic Israel. If that's the case, then they've got a really poor salvation, looking at everything that goes on over there. That's not salvation. They're still in the middle of it. It's not over for them. That is not the dream. That is not what God has promised them. What we're seeing is the setting of the stage for future events to occur in that part of the world, but that is not the fulfillment of prophecy. So if you think that, you're wrong. But there are some that will, in order to deny that there will be a future for Israel, that God has some kind of future purpose for says Jacob shall rejoice, that he has some kind of future purpose for Jacob, some kind of future purpose for Zion physically on this earth. You have to completely spiritualize every element of this verse in order to get there. You have to try to say, well, Israel is the church, Zion is heaven. Jacob, well, even though that it used the word Jacob in Israel, even though Jacob is only used to refer to the Jews, it must be talking about the church, because it can't be talking about the Jews, because that's not going to... You have to play this mental gymnastics, in order to squirm and worm your way through this maze to get out to where you want to be on the end of it, rather than just reading it for what it says, which is, "Oh, that the salvation of Israel were come out of Zion. When the Lord bringeth back the captivity of his people, Jacob shall rejoice, and Israel shall be glad." That nation has a future purpose, and God has a program, he has plans to use that nation, to set up that nation, to restore that nation, and that just hasn't happened yet. There is another way of looking at this, which is to say that it's already all been fulfilled at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and that it was fulfilled pre-Rome, which again I don't see as the case, because they have not had that independence. They have not had that. They have not had that salvation. They've been there, but they've been beset. Anytime they've been there, the people will point to the revolution of the Maccabees, which we don't have in our scriptures. It's you can read about it in some of the apocryphal texts, which are mostly historically accurate, not exactly 100%, so there's some exaggeration in there, which is one of the reasons why it wasn't canonized into Scripture. The Holy Spirit didn't allow it, because the Holy Spirit didn't inspire it. But you can read about that and understand a little bit about history, but even then, I don't care what time period you're looking at, the prophecies and the promises that have been made to Israel have not yet been fulfilled. They will be, but there's no point in history in which you can look and say they've all been fulfilled. I've heard one argument, which is that we don't have all of the texts and we don't have, our understanding of history is limited, and so there may have actually been a point in time in which they were fulfilled that we just don't know about. In which case, I point you to the book of Revelation and say, because that argument would typically refer to anything that's happened pre-Christ. And history is much clearer since Christ that no, that has not been the case because of the diaspora, because of the dispersion of the Jews around the world. We know for a fact they never had their promises kept to them as a nation during that time, because they couldn't function as a nation during that time. They were just a dispersed people. So, you would have to go back BC, and it just doesn't work out. The history just isn't there to support it, I don't think we're ignorant of that much about history that you can say that there was a perfect Israel at one point in time on the earth. And we just don't know about it. We just don't have the records of it. I don't think so. So, that is Psalm 14. Are there any questions about either one, Psalm 13 or 14?